Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we are post-free agency period. We're about to head into Vegas Summer League. What is the situation with the Timberwolves roster and their depth chart? What's next this offseason? It's all coming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Happy Monday, everybody. Hope you had a fantastic holiday weekend. And the Vegas Summer League starts this week. The Timberwolves play on Thursday afternoon. We'll talk about that a bit later in the week. If you missed it, on Friday, we did a Vegas Summer League roster primer. I went down the whole roster, talked about actual Timberwolves standard contract roster guys, rookies, second-year guys. We talked about the undrafted guys. We talked about Iowa Wolves players on the roster, the whole thing. We talked about all of it on Friday. Today, I want to do kind of like a half step backwards. We'll do like a 50,000-foot view of the roster, the offseason, the depth chart to this point. Or I should say the offseason to this point, the depth chart as of right now, July 7th. And looking at this is basically post-free agency. Obviously, the Wolves, and this is part of what we'll talk about, they have a couple of roster spots they can fill, at least one they need to fill. And we've speculated a lot about that over the last week. So I want to talk about that now that we're a week removed from the opening of free agency and kind of look at what's next here on the transaction, the offseason calendar, and we'll go from there. After today, we'll spend the rest of the week really kind of more focused on the Summer League. It will a bit more free agency talk as things continue to kind of shake out. But today is a bit more of a 50,000-foot view of where we sit on July 7th when it comes to Wolves roster and depth chart. First, though, big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right. So the offseason is that we're a week into the free agency period that opened last Monday. Minnesota, to this point, has only retained their own players. They've lost Nickeil Alexander-Walker via sign and trade, picked up a second-round pick as part of that deal. That's really the only thing that we've had happen here over the past week. Retain their own players. So that includes Reid, Julius, Randle, and of course, Joe Ingles. They've also, in addition to losing Alexander Walker, lost Luka Garza and Josh Minott after declining team options on both of those guys. They both signed with the Boston Celtics, as apparently the Celtics are, I guess, recreating Timberwolves East. I don't know. But at any rate, those are essentially the roster spots Minnesota now needs to fill. The three roster spots that are vacant are the Garza, Minott, and Alexander Walker spots. And the Wolves so far have only added Beranger, the first-round pick, Joan Beranger, as the backfilling one of those three spots. They still have two that are open. Now, the way that NBA rosters work, if you're not familiar, or just a really quick kind of primer on that, there are 15 spots on the roster. A team pretty much always has to carry 14. And there are a couple of rules. You have to have a minimum of 14. And you can drop to 13 for basically like 2 weeks at a time, a total of pretty much a month. I think it's a total of 4 weeks actually over the course of the season. Remember a couple seasons ago, Minnesota elevated Luka Garza from a two-way deal to a standard roster deal in order to fulfill a requirement, that minimum requirement. And also like TJ Warren. Remember TJ Warren a couple of years ago being signed to fulfill the minimum roster requirement. Minnesota could go a little bit longer with only 13 on the roster. But I think it's very likely they fill one of them now. They have to sign a 14th player. There's a minimum of 14. They only have 13. The maximum is 15. So my guess is Minnesota does just add one more player between now and training camp. And I think it's probably sooner rather than later. I don't know, but that's my guess. I feel pretty strongly that they'll only fill 14 of the 15 spots and leave one open. Remember, they did that last year until ultimately signing PJ Dozier to a partially guaranteed deal and then allowing him or waiving him, I should say. I think it was in January last year before the contract became fully guaranteed. And perhaps that's the same thing Tim Conley will do. And the reason you leave that last roster spot open is to give yourself maximum flexibility. We've talked about this a lot on the show, but to have roster versatility, the ability to pivot. Remember, Julius Randle's contract technically being an extension and not a free agent signing. It's not just semantics. It actually matters because a new free agent can't be traded for several months. I think it's 6 months is the rule, or December 15th or something like that. So that stipulation goes away if it's an extension of your own guy. So Randall's contract technically being an extension means that Minnesota could trade him. And that's what's been reported, is that that's how that's all going to get processed. So Minnesota, if they wanted to, could pivot. I don't think they're going to yet at this point, but they could turn around and trade Julius Randle if they thought it made sense. Obviously, Naz Reid's contract is, they're not going to trade Naz Reid, but it's tradable. So if it's, next trade deadline, if the Wolves are 15 games under 500 because something catastrophic happens, hopefully that's not the case, and they need to make some sort of pivot or whatever, everything they have on their roster right now is tradable. They really don't have any albatrosses at all. We know Dante DiVincenzo is a tradable contract, but all that to say, maximum roster flexibility. And so by leaving that 15th roster spot open, it gives you that. Minnesota can still perform a 2-for-1 trade. They could take 2 players back for one because they are not hard capped at this point. They're not all the way up against that second apron. So they could do that if they wanted to. And it's your 15th roster spot. And I know as people that cover the Wolves every day, and fans and bloggers, et cetera, like, it's fun to kind of try and figure out like who's going to get that 15th spot. It doesn't really matter, right? Like, nobody's winning or losing a title based on who your 15th guy is. And that's also was part of my explanation for why I wasn't all up in arms about the Joe Ingles edition, like, or the Joe Ingles, I guess, reacquisition, right? Who cares? Like, that's not going to make or break your season. And you look at all these like good teams, like nobody's 15th guy is like making or breaking any of this. Could you find a diamond in the rough? Yeah. And that's part of the reason why they're leaving it open. That's part of the reason why, they haven't made, that's part of the reason why Leonard Miller is still on the team, right? Because if you really wanted to maximize the roster, wouldn't you rather have somebody that could help you right now? Or would you rather have somebody, that has like, would you use that spot differently if all things were equal, right? But you can't play 15 guys anyway. And realistically, you're not going to have 5 bench guys who are all like third string veterans who can step in case somebody has an extended injury. So yeah, it matters how you manage it. And that's exactly why they're leaving it open, because ultimately they can fill it with a PJ Dozier type player. I don't think they'll do that again. But we've seen them do that sort of a thing. And maybe it's, I don't think it is, I hope it's not, but like a Bones Highland, right? Like guys that Tim Conley has history with, he develops these relationships with guys and everybody wins in that sort of a scenario. And maybe it is, that the 15th spot ends up being another young player. Maybe it ends up being a fringy roster type. I rattled off a bunch of guys last week of guys Minnesota could go after as their 14th roster spot. Maybe they do sign somebody sooner rather than later that could contribute. I've talked about Malcolm Brogdon, like that would be great. And then maybe your 15th spot ends up being it wouldn't be another guard, but like a DeLon Wright, like somebody who's not expecting to play, Markieff Morris, right? I don't think they'll do that necessarily because they already have Joe Ingles on the roster and he kind of is that veteran who's not expecting to play. But could they add another one? Yeah, they could, I guess. That's always a possibility. The trick is, and we'll talk about the depth chart here in a little bit, it matters a little bit more if the Wolves end up having these guys that they're not expecting to play, right? Like Beranger and Joe Ingles for different reasons, right? But Beranger is not going to play right away. Joe Ingles probably isn't going to play. They clearly don't want to rely on Leonard Miller to play. So you end up with so many of these guys that you're not relying on. How deep is your real depth? Like, does it go 10 guys? Does it go 11 guys? And that's, as they fill out the depth chart, something we're going to have to keep an eye on. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the two-way contracts and the overall depth chart. What's next in this offseason? We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors at FanDuel. Summer sports are in full swing. Maybe you're all about baseball under the lights. The Twins had a good weekend, by the way. After struggling a bit in the schedule, they won a series against a good team in the Tampa Bay Rays. Maybe you're into golf on the green or high-stakes soccer action. FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little bit more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned at the beach. Instead, just add more excitement to your sports watching. You use FanDuel to track your favorite matchups. The app will keep it fresh. With new daily promotions and fun ways to bet, it is easy to use, fast to pay out, and even makes regular season games feel like must-watch events. Maybe you're placing a same-game parlay. You just want to pay attention to the Twins game, maybe MLB All-Star game next week. Watch a bet right into the ninth inning. FanDuel will make it feel like you're part of the action. New to FanDuel? Well, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right, let's go ahead and talk a bit more about the roster, and then we'll get into the depth chart here. So Minnesota has 13 spots filled. They have to fill one more. They can fill up to two more to get to the 15-man roster maximum. My prediction is they sign one guy, they leave the other open at least until training camp. Remember, you can go up to 20 guys total on non-guaranteed contracts in the offseason. They will have 3 two-way guys. That means that they could add 2 or 3 non-guaranteed contracts, Exhibit 10 contracts, right? We've seen them sign those every year. It's usually like 1 or 2 veterans and then 1 or 2 guys who are kind of fringe roster guys, almost like summer league type guys. And that's a little bit of a carrot for the summer league guys too, right? Like these guys they brought in to play summer league. If they play really well, the Wolves could say, hey, we're extending a training camp invite and this Exhibit 10 contract, which means you're essentially like the way I always say it is like a preferred walk-on in college, right? Like you're in training camp, you get paid to be there. If you stay with the Iowa Wolves of the G League, then you receive, it's like a $50,000 bonus if you stick with their $80,000 or something. If you're with that team for 30 days or 60 days or something. Before we get to that point, I'll make sure I have all those details right. But it's essentially like a stay bonus to stick with the G League affiliate of the Major League team. So look at the summer league roster, and it could be somebody like we talked about. I don't know, guys who were on the Iowa Wolves team last year, like I almost said Ace Bailey. I'm blanking his first name, but the other Bailey that's on the summer league roster. It could be somebody that's got NBA experience, like Jamal Cain, right? Who played with Charlotte, who played with Miami, or New Orleans and Miami. He's a guy who could make the team, or who could be a big part of the Iowa Wolves team. And that's who you might consider giving an Exhibit 10 to. So they've got a few of those contracts to play with that are non-guaranteed. And then of their two-way contracts, they've already filled 2 of the 3. Remember Jesse Edwards, who was on a 2-way deal last year. He's a 25-year-old second-year center, 5-year college guy. He's in a 2-way spot. And then Rocco Zikarsky, the 18-year-old Australian 7'3" big man that they drafted, that trade actually finally went through on Sunday, that 7-team trade. And it was all kind of included because the nature of these things following the draft is they take so long. You have to have individual trade calls for each of them usually. And this way it all happened at once, even though it still took a few days. Now that trade is final, and Rocco Zikarsky, the Wolves haven't officially announced it as of this recording, but he'll undoubtedly be added to the Las Vegas Summer League roster. Very curious to see what kind of run he gets in Vegas, but seems to be extremely likely he'll be on the roster at the very least and get a chance to play in Vegas. So Zikarsky is also on a 2-year, 2-way deal, meaning that there's only one 2-way roster spot open. Remember last year, the final 2, besides Edwards, were Bones Highland, the veteran who is a free agent, and Tristan Newton, who Minnesota claimed off waivers from the Indiana Pacers December-ish last year. Tristan Newton is on the Summer League roster, so remains to be seen if he's going to come back on a 2-way. My guess is he wants to play out Summer League and see if he gets an offer somewhere else for an actual roster spot with another team. The Summer League is basically a showcase for all 30 teams anyway, and Minnesota had extended, reportedly, the qualifying offer to Newton as a restricted free agent on a 2-way deal. So it's very likely he's back, but we don't know that yet. So Minnesota still has their third 2-way contract spot available as well. Now, if we look at the depth chart, this is where it starts to get a little, I don't want to say dicey, and I think largely Minnesota's at the same place they were when the season ended, right? The only thing is Alexander Walker's gone, because the Minot and Garza roles, it's important to fill those roster spots with, like, it needs to make sense what you're doing. But the only rotation guy that's gone is Alexander Walker. And as we talked about quite a bit already on the show, the plan to backfill his minutes is probably some combination of Rob Dillingham and TJ Shannon, to a lesser extent Jaylen Clark. Like, they're going to try and create the production that Alexander Walker provided in the aggregate. And that's the plan at the moment. I mean, maybe if they sign Malcolm Brogdon, that's somebody who they're actually going to rely on to play some real minutes. Not really sure how that's all going to shake out. But sitting here right now, the starting point guard is still Mike Conley. And maybe by December, it's Rob Dillingham. We said that last year. It didn't happen. Maybe it takes until February, March before it's Rob Dillingham. But Mike Conley's got 1 year left on his deal. He's going to be 38. It's like $10 million, a little over $10 million. And then he's very likely, I would assume, would retire. Maybe at that point, if he's still, shooting the ball well or whatever, perhaps he turns into the Joe Ingles role where he gets a minimum deal. He's an end of bench type guy. They could try and get him a ring, whatever. That's definitely a possibility. It's not, I mean, who knows? But this is his last year where he will at least start the year as a starter. I'm confident that's going to be the case. Should Rob Dillingham take over? Well, we don't know. It depends on how he performs in training camp, preseason, into the regular season as his primary backup. But he is the backup point guard. I mean, it's besides Rob Dillingham, it's Dante DiVincenzo and Ant are the only other guys that are going to handle the ball as point guards. I mean, Julius Randle is kind of next up as a point forward, right? So it's Conley and it's Rob Dillingham, and that's it. And then your two guards are Ant and DiVincenzo, and then I guess Jaylen Clark would be the next one you'd put there. So like your 5 1s and 2s, your 5 backcourt guys are Conley and Dillingham, Ant, DiVincenzo, and Jaylen Clark. At the 3, of course, guys who can largely go either way, like Jaden McDaniels is your starting 3. Of course, he plays some minutes at the 4, not as much as he used to, but we've seen him do it in certain lineups. And TJ Shannon, who same deal, can play small ball 4. He could also play the 2. And then Joe Ingles, I would lump in there as a 3/4 as well. So that's your, to use an old fashioned term, small forwards, Jaden, TJ Shannon, and Joe Ingles. And then at the 4, it's Julius Randle and Naz Reid. And at the 5, it's Rudy Gobert. And then it's Leonard Miller and Jean Beranger. And that's it. So I would kind of lump the 1s and 2s together. Those 5 guys, Conley, Dillingham, Clark, Ant, and DiVincenzo, and your 5 bigs together, Randle, Naz, Rudy, Miller, and Beranger. And that's your roster. So this is where we had this conversation, and we'll get into this here at the end of the show today, but I spent a lot of time on this last week, or actually, I guess we could just talk about it now. What does Minnesota do with these final 2 roster spots? Well, you don't really have a trustworthy backup 1 other than Rob Dillingham. And of course, what happens if, God forbid, Conley or Rob Dillingham gets hurt early in the season? If it's anything of any, even if it's more than just a few days, what's the plan? There's nobody else. It's Ant and Dante that are going to have to run your offense. So it kind of feels like you need to add, like Nikhil wasn't a point guard, but at least he played one on TV, and at least he was there in case you needed him. And of course, they often had somebody on a 2-way that could, like Bones Highland at the end of the year was that type of a, like, if we need him, he can play. But they need another point guard, you would think. And then at the 5, with no Luka Garza, who again played probably less than a dozen games last year as a rotation member of the rotation. So we're not talking about an every night guy, but if you are trying to get 50, 55 wins and win a title, you need another big. I mean, Randle, Naz, and Rudy are your only rotation bigs. They don't trust Miller. And Beranger, as an 18-year-old, is not about to play rotation minutes, even in an emergency situation. So who is your, call it 5th guard and 5th big, or actually 4th big, 5th guard and 4th big? Now, in a pinch, what would happen? Well, they would play smaller, and Jaden could play the 4. And like, say Rudy's out, well, Naz plays the 5, and Randall's your 4, and Jaden's your backup 4, and you just kind of piece it together that way. If Conley gets hurt, then I guess Dillingham starts and Dante plays your backup 1 minute, whatever. But that's not sustainable over more than a few days. And if you want to win basketball games, if you want to get to where you want to go. So obviously Minnesota is going to address this on some level. I know there's some movement out there, people on X talking about like, hey, don't sign a Malcolm Brogdon, don't sign a, somebody, Spencer Dinwiddie obviously isn't coming. He's signed elsewhere, I think Charlotte. Because that means that Rob's not going to play. Yeah, but you got to sign somebody who could do something if Conley like literally can't function, or if Rob you still need another guard. So one of those 2 spots has to be somebody that can do something, whether it's a point guard or it's a 5, and hopefully both of those spots are guys, because if you're already kind of chalking up that Joe Ingles, Leonard Miller, and Jean Beranger, those three guys are essentially not playable. Now you're down to 10 guys. That's it. So how does this roster get filled out? And looking at the depth chart, it's, how do they play that with the call it the backup Rudy and the backup Conley / Rob? I mean, they got to have a plan for that. All right, we'll talk about the rest of the offseason, what's up next on the calendar for the Wolves and their roster building. We'll do all that here next to close out the show. All right, so we are still obviously in a free agency period, and that continues. We start to see movement decrease, just the nature of a lot of guys have been signed, and Summer League, and you just don't see quite as many trades this time of year. A lot of stuff became official over the weekend, the 7-team deal being the biggest thing, but there's a handful of other contracts, et cetera, that became official. And there's a few things that we're seeing happen, like extensions and things like that. But by and large, outside of Summer League, this is the quietest part of the NBA calendar. The other thing that's been interesting that's been going on is the Jonas Valanciunas thing, where it looked like Valanciunas may go back overseas and play in Greece. And then now the trade's getting finalized. And at this moment, it still looks like he's going to play behind Nikola Jokic in Denver. But that's a massive deal because he makes them so much deeper. And if he ends up not going to Denver, that's going to really put a damper on their offseason. So probably a quieter period in terms of transactions. Remember, last year, the Wolves didn't hardly do anything during this period of time. But then the Randle Towns trade happened in late September. So those things can sneak up. That was, completely, it's hard to believe, by the way, that was not even a year ago. It feels like it was, 2 years ago that Karl-Anthony Towns was in a Timberwolves uniform. But that trade was we're still not even 10 months out from when that trade happened, which is just crazy at this point to think about. Related, I should mention also, there was a note in, I think it was the Mark Stein article, his Substack that he has about the Naz Reid and the Suns' pursuit of Naz Reid in a sign-and trade. And ultimately, of course, they traded for Mark Williams, he of the almost Lakers trade at the deadline last year, or I guess Lakers trade. Not almost. It was a Lakers trade, and then it wasn't. That they tried to sign and trade for Naz Reid, and that also Naz Reid's extension is part of what Miles Turner looked at that and was like, all right, well, the Pacers aren't giving me 5 years, $125 million like the Wolves just gave Naz. So I want to go to Milwaukee. And then the sign and trade happened. So fascinating that so much hinged on Naz. And we kind of knew that, like, he's a bit of a bellwether. And the funny thing is, like, you listen to some of the other national, like the Bill Simmons podcast, like he and Ryan Russillo were talking about Naz's contract looking like a valuable contract based on the type of player he is. I think it's somewhere in the middle where both sides win. Like, Naz is certainly limited. I shouldn't say it that way. He certainly has limitations, as most players do. And you could argue that they gave him a lot of years for being a guy who's spotty defensively and undersized and not always a great rebounder and kind of disappeared at times in the playoffs, like all those things. But still what he is, and certainly the regular season player and the security he gives you from an offensive scoring standpoint in the front court, like, that's not a bad contract. We talked about this last week after the signing happened, that I think it's valuable, and it's certainly a good deal for Naz. So all that to say, it's just interesting that there's kind of this domino effect around the league of what ended up happening with Naz Reid. So we'll see what else happens here over the next few weeks. The next big, the options are all passed for Minnesota. The next options to keep an eye out for from a team standpoint aren't until October. And that would be the first round draft pick rookie deal options that teams have to pick up for the following season. So as a reminder, last day of October, Halloween, Rob Dillingham and TJ Shannon, as first round picks last year, have club options that need to get exercised by the Wolves by the last day of October, which used to be basically the first day of the regular season. And now it starts, 10 days earlier or whatever. So it'll be a few games into the season, but the Wolves undoubtedly at this point would be planning to pick up both of them. TJ Shannon's likely, both guys are probably rotation guys this year. So those options will be picked up at the end of October. They almost always are that first option, the year 3 in the league for rookies. And then that's kind of it as of now. Now, if they end up signing a guy with a partially guaranteed deal like PJ Dozier last year or somebody the year before, I want to say maybe the year Austin Rivers was on the team, he had a partial guarantee, where it became fully guaranteed in January. Usually it's the first couple weeks of January. So like obviously Rivers stayed on the team, and Minnesota last year waived PJ Dozier. So they may sign a guy to a deal like that, but that's kind of it in terms of the upcoming options for Minnesota. So we'll do Vegas Summer League this week and next week. And of course, here on the show, we'll have you covered there. We'll talk to Andrew Dukowitz of Zone Coverage and the Daily Wolves. He does a really good job over at those outlets. He's going to be in Vegas. We'll talk to him later this week about a bit of an on-site report. And we'll talk about how the young guys are doing, how the non-roster guys are doing in Vegas. And here the next couple of days, I'll get you ready for what to expect in Vegas. We'll talk about like top things to look out for, predictions in Vegas, some stuff like that. I always think that's kind of fun. It's a bit of dart throwing, but based on what we know about Vegas Summer League and based on what we know about some of the guys the Wolves are sending, I think that could be a lot of fun. And that's what we'll do here over the next few days. So Wolves open up on Thursday afternoon in Las Vegas. We'll talk more about that here soon. And again, guests over the coming days into the Vegas week, we'll call it, end of this week into next week. And then we'll slow it down a little bit in terms of actual on-court news, and we'll take a step back and we'll look at, maybe a couple of things from what happened over the past season, what to expect here this season, some bigger picture things here as we're still daily through the month of July before we go to 3 shows a week in August. That's all we got for you today. Big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. Of course, Locked On Wolves is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.